Hi everyone, welcome to our channel, where we share meaningful and inspiring stories every day. Today, I want to take you on a journey, a story about kindness, transformation, and how small acts can create a big impact in someone's life. If you love heartfelt stories, life-changing lessons, and want to spread positivity to the world, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing more amazing stories to life. Now, let's dive into the incredible journey of two people from very different worlds who came together to create a story you won't want to miss. In a quiet little neighborhood, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the city, there stood an old, decrepit house, shrouded in silence. It seemed like a speck of dust, abandoned by time itself. Its brick walls were weathered and dull, covered in patches of moss that crept along the surface like memories refusing to fade. Cracks ran through the walls like the veins of an aged tree, and its wooden door hung ajar, its hinges creaking with every gust of wind, as if whispering secrets from a long-forgotten past. The house didn't just look old, it exuded an aura of mystery that was hard to describe. From a distance, the overgrown garden around it seemed like a veil, concealing something unspeakable. Wild weeds grew unchecked, tangling and twisting like frail, gnarled fingers grasping at the air. Tall trees loomed over the house, their heavy branches casting deep shadows that blended with the moss-covered walls, creating an eerie, somber atmosphere. Even sunlight seemed reluctant to enter the garden. Its rays barely managed to pierce through the dense canopy of leaves, scattering faint patterns on the ground, shapes so peculiar they seemed to tell a story of their own, one of sorrow and darkness. No one in the neighborhood paid attention to the house. To adults, it was nothing more than an abandoned structure, unworthy of their concern. To children, it was taboo. Occasionally, a few brave souls dared each other to approach the house, but the moment they felt the uncanny chill emanating from it, they would shudder and run away. Inside the shadowy house, beneath layers of dust and an oppressive stillness, there was an attic. A space forgotten by the world, and within that attic sat Lily, a 6-year-old girl, curled up in a corner. Her small frame was wrapped in a thin, worn-out sweater that did little to protect her from the cold. Her frail shoulders trembled slightly as icy drafts swept in through the cracks in the window. Around her was the stale smell of mold and decaying wood, the scent of a place untouched and unloved for years. Each breath Lily took seemed to cut through the suffocating air, making the silence around her even more deafening. The only light in the attic came from a narrow crack in the wall. Through it, faint beams of sunlight streamed in daily, forming a weak, flickering streak on the old wooden floor. Yet, the light barely illuminated the room. Instead, it accentuated the surrounding darkness, making the shadows seem even more oppressive, as if they were closing in on her. Whenever the light appeared, Lily would crawl toward it and press her face to the crack. Through the narrow opening, she could see the world beyond, the vibrant blue sky and the leaves swaying gently in the wind. Sometimes, a little bird would perch on a nearby branch and sing a cheerful tune, reminding Lily that a different, freer life existed outside these walls. For Lily, that outside world was like a dream, a place so distant that she dared not believe it could ever be hers. She couldn't imagine walking under the sun, feeling its warmth on her skin, or hearing the laughter of people. She didn't know how long she had been confined to this attic. Time felt meaningless in this place. Each day was a monotonous loop of the same sounds. The creak of the wooden floor as she moved, the faint chirping of insects in the garden outside, and the haunting sigh of the wind slipping through the cracks. Lily often thought about her life before, when her mother was still alive. She remembered the cozy little house they lived in, where her mother's warm smile lit up even the darkest days. She remembered the songs her mother sang to lull her to sleep, the fairy tales told in a gentle voice, and the comforting embrace that made her feel safe from the world. But everything changed on that fateful day. The accident had taken her mother away, leaving Lily adrift in a sea of loss. Her father, once the steadfast anchor of their family, was unable to bear the weight of his grief. He disappeared, leaving Lily in the care of her Aunt Margaret, the only family she had left. Margaret hadn't always been a cruel woman. She once had dreams of her own and a heart that yearned for love. As a young woman, Margaret had fallen deeply in love with Lily's father. To her, he was everything, kind, handsome, and the embodiment of hope. But her love was unrequited. He chose her younger sister instead, a woman who was gentle, radiant, and seemingly perfect in every way. Their marriage was a wound Margaret carried silently, one that festered with time. She tried to distance herself from their happiness, but fate wouldn't allow her to escape. The death of her sister and the arrival of Lily forced her to confront the past she had worked so hard to bury. Every time Margaret looked at Lily, she saw the man she once loved and the sister who had taken him away. It was too much. The girl's wide, innocent eyes and delicate smile reminded Margaret of everything she had lost, of the life she believed should have been hers. So Margaret locked Lily away in the attic. The attic became Lily's entire world, a place devoid of love or warmth. The child endured the cold, the hunger, and the solitude, but she never gave up hope. In her heart, Lily told herself stories. She imagined she was a princess trapped in a high tower, waiting for the day a brave knight would come to rescue her. Outside the house, the overgrown gardens swayed with the wind. Birds occasionally perched on the branches, chirping a few notes before flying away, as if even they couldn't bear to stay near the oppressive shadows for long. Each time Lily pressed her face to the crack in the wall, she whispered to herself, "One day, I'll leave this place. I'll be free." But deep down she wondered if that day would ever come. For now, all she had was the faint light streaming through the crack in the wall, the single thread of hope keeping her spirit alive. Lily once had a family. Before everything fell apart, she lived in a small, warm house with her mother. The memories of her mother were a flickering flame in her mind, a fragile light that kept her from collapsing entirely into despair. Her mother was a gentle woman, always wearing a soft smile, even when life seemed unbearably hard. She had a calmness about her, a strength that came not from harsh words or stern looks, but from an unwavering kindness that radiated through her every gesture. Her mother would sing lullabies to her at night, her voice low and soothing, filling their little house with melodies that made Lily feel as though the world outside couldn't touch them. On colder nights, they would sit together under a quilt, her mother's arms wrapped around her small frame. She told Lily stories, tales of brave princesses, of kingdoms far away, of struggles and triumphs. And every story would end with the same soft words. "You, my little Lily, are like a candle that lights up the whole world." For Lily, her mother was her entire world. Her presence was a constant, a safety net that caught her whenever the small bumps of childhood sent her tumbling. But life, unpredictable and cruel, had different plans. The day of the accident remained etched in Lily's memory, clear and sharp like glass shards. The faint glow of headlights on a dark road, the sudden, jarring screech of brakes cutting through the quiet night. "Ah!" And then her mother's scream. A sound so visceral, so raw, it was like the world itself was being torn apart. And then there was darkness. When Lily woke, her world was irrevocably changed. Her mother was gone, and the warmth of their little house had been replaced by a void that seemed impossible to fill. Her father, once the unshakable pillar of their family, couldn't bear the weight of his grief. He withdrew into himself, his once strong frame slumped under the burden of loss. And one day he left. He didn't say goodbye, nor did he explain why. He simply disappeared, leaving Lily in the care of the only family member who remained, her Aunt Margaret. Margaret wasn't always a bitter woman. There was a time when she too had been a dreamer. As a young girl, she was filled with hope, her heart full of longing for a love that would complete her. Margaret had fallen deeply in love with Lily's father. To her, he was everything: kind, intelligent, and gentle in a way that seemed to promise a lifetime of happiness. But her love was unreturned. Lily's father had chosen Margaret's younger sister, a woman who was everything Margaret felt she wasn't. She was radiant, vibrant, with a natural charm that drew people to her. Margaret watched as the man she loved fell for her sister, watched as they built a life together, and she was left behind, carrying the weight of unspoken jealousy and heartbreak. The marriage was a wound that never truly healed. While her sister lived a life filled with love and laughter, Margaret grew more resentful, retreating into her own world where bitterness festered. When her sister died unexpectedly and Lily was placed in her care, Margaret wasn't ready. She hadn't moved past her pain. Looking at Lily was like reopening the old wound all over again. The girl's wide, innocent eyes, so much like her father's, stirred feelings Margaret had long tried to bury. It wasn't Lily's fault, but Margaret couldn't separate the child from the memories she carried. To Margaret, Lily wasn't just a child in need of love. She was a constant reminder of what Margaret had lost: the man who never loved her, the sister who had overshadowed her, and the life she believed was meant to be hers. The breaking point came one day when Lily, curious and innocent, picked up a photograph of her parents. She asked Margaret about the man in the picture, her voice filled with childlike wonder. Margaret's heart clenched. The photograph brought back everything she had tried to suppress: the smiles, the laughter, the joy that wasn't hers to share. Her voice turned cold, her face stern. "Go to the attic," she said, her tone as sharp as broken glass, "and don't come down unless I tell you to." Lily didn't understand what she had done wrong. Her small hands trembled as she placed the photograph back where she had found it, but she obeyed. From that day forward, the attic became Lily's home. It was a small, dark space that smelled of mildew and rotting wood. The air was damp, heavy, and oppressive, as though the room itself was pressing down on her tiny frame. Margaret would bring her food: a slice of stale bread, a cup of water in a plastic tumbler, but never more than what was necessary to keep her alive. The attic was silent except for the creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath Lily's small feet and the faint hum of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. The darkness was her constant companion, enveloping her, whispering fears into her ears. But even in the depths of despair, Lily held on to hope. She remembered her mother's words, the stories of brave princesses overcoming impossible odds. In the attic, she told herself those stories, imagining she was a princess locked in a tower, waiting for the day a kind soul would come to rescue her. Outside, the world continued to turn. The seasons changed, the trees outside the house swayed in the wind, and birds chirped on the branches. But inside, time stood still. For Lily, each day blended into the next, a monotonous cycle of shadows and silence. She would crawl to the small window, pressing her face to the cold glass. Beyond it, she could see the sky, sometimes gray and heavy with clouds, sometimes bright and blue. It was a glimpse of a world she could no longer touch, a reminder that life carried on without her. Margaret never spoke of Lily to anyone. To the world, it was as though the little girl didn't exist, but Margaret knew. She felt the weight of her choices, the guilt that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. Yet she couldn't stop. Each time she looked at Lily, the old pain surged back, and Margaret found herself retreating further into her bitterness. For Lily, the attic was both a prison and a sanctuary. It was the only world she knew, but it was also the place where she clung to the fragile thread of hope her mother had left her. She would look out the window and whisper to herself, "One day, I'll leave this place. One day, I'll be free." But even as she whispered those words, she wondered if they were true. The days stretched on, and the light from the window remained her only connection to the world outside. A faint, flickering reminder that hope, no matter how small, could still survive in the darkest of places. She often imagined herself as a princess locked away in a high tower, waiting for a brave knight to rescue her. The dim, confined attic transformed in her mind's eye into a towering fortress, surrounded by an impenetrable forest. The jagged edges of broken furniture became ancient battlements, and the dust swirling in the air turned into glittering particles of magic. Lily clung to this fantasy with every ounce of her being. It was her way of surviving, her way of holding on to hope. "Out day the light will come for me," she whispered to herself, repeating the words her mother had told her so long ago. Her voice was soft, almost inaudible in the oppressive silence of the attic. It was a mantra, a lifeline, and she whispered it often, especially in the darkest hours when the cold crept in and her stomach ached from hunger. The nights in the attic were the worst. The air seemed heavier after the sun went down, the silence deeper. The only sounds were the faint creaking of the house settling and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the cracked window. Lily would curl up on the hard wooden floor, clutching a threadbare blanket around her tiny frame. She tried not to think about the shadows that loomed in the corners, their shapes shifting with every flicker of the moonlight. One such night, unable to sleep, Lily decided to explore the corners of her makeshift prison. She had memorized every crack and crevice of the attic, but the small pile of discarded items in the farthest corner still held some mystery. The air was colder there, and the floorboards groaned under her slight weight as she approached. Her hands, small and trembling, reached into the pile, brushing against objects coated in years of dust. It was then that her fingers closed around something smooth and rectangular. She pulled it out and held it up to the faint light filtering through the attic's lone crack. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. A cell phone. The device was old, its surface scratched and grimy, its buttons were worn, and the screen was dull with age. But it was a phone nonetheless, and in Lily's mind, it might as well have been a magic wand. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. "Does it still work?" she wondered aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Her hands shook as she pressed the power button. At first, nothing happened, and her heart sank. But then, a faint light flickered on the screen, dim but unmistakable. It was working. Lily's breath hitched, her chest tightening with a mix of excitement and fear. In that moment, a memory surfaced, her teacher's voice from what felt like a lifetime ago. "If you're ever in danger, call 911 at least a couple of times," the teacher had said. The words had seemed irrelevant then, something meant for a world far removed from her own. But now, they echoed in her mind with clarity and purpose. Lily hesitated. The phone felt heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. A chance, a risk, a possible escape. What if it doesn't work, she thought. What if someone finds out? But hope, fragile and persistent, pushed her forward. Slowly, carefully, she pressed the numbers. 911. Her hands trembled so much she had to steady the phone against her knees. The phone began to ring. The sound was faint, tinny, but it was there. Lily held her breath, her small frame frozen with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, a deep, calm voice came through the line. 911, what's your emergency? Lily's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Her throat felt tight, and she swallowed hard. What if they don't believe me? The thought flashed through her mind. "Hello, this is 911. How can I help you?" The voice repeated, gentle but insistent. I'm Lily," she finally managed to whisper. Her voice was so soft that the operator had to ask her to repeat herself. "Lily, are you safe? What's happening?" the man asked, his tone steady but filled with concern. I'm trapped," she said, her words trembling like leaves in the wind. "In the attic of my house. Tom, the 911 operator, felt his chest tighten. He had heard many distress calls in his career, but there was something about the frailty in Lily's voice, the sheer weight of fear and desperation, that made this one different. He knew he had to keep her calm. "Okay, Lily, you're doing great. Can you tell me what you see around you? Maybe through a window." Lily turned her head toward the small crack in the wall, the one source of light in her prison. "Trees," she said, her voice trembling. "I see a lot of trees." Tom nodded to himself, taking notes while signaling his team to prepare. "That's very helpful, Lily. We're going to find you, but I need you to stay on the line with me, okay?" "Okay," she whispered. Her small fingers gripped the phone tightly as if it were a lifeline. She felt a spark of hope igniting within her, a light she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. But alongside the hope came a wave of fear. "What if my aunt finds out?" she murmured, almost to herself. "She'll be so angry. She'll be so mad at me." Han's heart ached at the fear in her voice. He softened his tone even further. You don't need to worry about that, Lily. We're coming to help you. Just stay with me. You're not alone anymore." His words carried a certainty that Lily desperately wanted to believe in. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and clung to his voice as though it were the only thing keeping her afloat. In the attic, the air felt a little lighter. The shadows didn't seem as menacing, and the cold didn't bite as hard. For the first time in a long while, Lily felt that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to wait for the brave night to come. Perhaps the light she had been hoping for was already on its way. And so, she stayed there, clutching the phone, her heart oscillating between fear and hope as Tom's calm voice guided her through the darkness. Little did she know, the world outside was already beginning to move for her, and her silent cries were about to be answered. The night had deepened when the rescue team received the call from dispatch. The road leading to the old decrepit house was swallowed by darkness, interrupted only by the sharp beams of headlights illuminating the jagged, uneven pavement. The air grew colder with every passing moment, biting through layers of clothing, and the heavy silence wrapped itself around the team like a suffocating shroud. Each man felt it, an unspoken unease, a creeping dread that settled in their bones and made their breaths shallow. Inside the rescue vehicle, Tom sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the glowing digital map in his hands. His mind, however, was elsewhere, consumed by the fragile voice of a little girl named Lily. He had handled countless calls in his decade-long career, fires, accidents, cries for help in the dead of night, but something about this one burrowed into his soul. Her voice, trembling and small, played over and over in his mind. "I'm trapped in the attic," she had said. It wasn't just fear he had heard. It was desperation, a raw, haunting vulnerability that spoke of prolonged suffering. Tom couldn't shake the urgency, the feeling that they were racing against an unseen clock, and every second mattered. The vehicle came to a halt, its tires crunching against the gravel-strewn driveway. "We're here," the driver announced, his voice barely more than a murmur, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the oppressive stillness surrounding the house. The team stepped out, their boots landing heavily on the ground. For a moment, no one moved. They simply stood there, staring at the house that loomed before them under the dim light of the moon. It was monstrous in its desolation, a relic of a time long past, its walls cloaked in moss and shadow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dark voids, as though the house itself had hollow eyes. In the pale moonlight, it seemed to breathe, its silhouette shifting subtly with the swaying of the tall trees around it. Tom broke the silence. "This is the place," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "She said she's in the attic." The team nodded, and Tom led the way, stepping into the overgrown yard. The tall grass reached their knees, whispering against their boots with each step. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, the scent growing stronger as they neared the house. At the front door, Tom knocked firmly. The sound echoed, unnervingly loud against the silence. He knocked again, harder this time, then again. No response. "Let's try the windows," someone suggested, but a quick inspection revealed they were sealed tight, either locked from the inside or too warped to budge. "We'll have to break in," said one of the team members, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. Tom hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Do it." The battering ram slammed against the door with a deafening crash. Wood splintered, the sound reverberating into the night and scattering the silence like shards of glass. A second blow sent the door flying open, revealing a yawning void of darkness. Tom flicked on his flashlight, its beam slicing through the blackness to reveal an interior cloaked in neglect. The walls were streaked with grime, their paint peeling away in long, curling strips. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the flashlight's glow, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris. "Lily!" Tom called out, his voice firm but not loud enough to frighten. His words echoed back to him, bouncing off the walls in eerie repetition. The team fanned out cautiously, their flashlights scanning the room. Every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their boots sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. The house felt alive, its silence pulsating, as though it were watching, waiting. Tom's heart thudded heavily in his chest. He called out again, louder this time. "Lily, where are you?" No response, just the echo of his own voice. "We should head upstairs," one of the team members suggested. Tom nodded, already moving toward the staircase. The stairs groaned under their weight, the old wood protesting every step. The air grew colder as they ascended, the kind of chill that seeped into the skin and seemed to freeze the soul. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out like a tunnel, its darkness almost impenetrable. The attic door was at the far end, a warped and faded panel that seemed to sag on its hinges. Tom reached it first, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, with a firm twist, he pushed it open. The attic was a cavern of shadows, its slanted ceiling low and oppressive. Tom swept his flashlight across the room, the beam revealing the bare bones of the space, a few broken chairs, stacks of forgotten boxes, and a thick blanket of dust covering everything. And then he saw her. Lily was curled up in the far corner, a small figure barely visible in the dim light. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. She turned her head at the sound of the door opening, her wide, frightened eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. Tom felt his breath catch. She looked so small, so fragile, her thin frame swallowed by the shadows around her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Tom took a cautious step forward, lowering his flashlight slightly to avoid blinding her. "Lily," he said gently, "it's okay. We're here to help you." Her lips trembled and she looked at him as though unsure whether to trust him. Are you going to take me away?" she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the stillness. "Yes," Tom said firmly. "We're going to get you out of here. You're safe now." He crouched down, extending a hand toward her. "Will you come with me?" For a long moment, Lily didn't move. Then, slowly, she uncurled herself and reached out. Her small hand slid into his, and Tom felt the coldness of her skin, a chill that spoke of months, maybe years, of neglect. "We've got her," Tom called over his shoulder, his voice breaking slightly with relief. As he led her out of the attic, Lily glanced back once, her eyes lingering on the room that had been her prison. And then she turned away, her grip tightening on Tom's hand as they descended the stairs, toward the light, toward freedom. In the attic, Lily sat curled up in the corner, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. The air around her was thick with cold, heavy with silence that was only broken by faint noises from below. At first, she froze, her small frame stiffening against the damp wooden wall. These were not the familiar, deliberate footsteps of Aunt Margaret. The sounds were heavier, purposeful, and sent an electric jolt of fear and hope surging through her veins. Have they come for me? She thought, her chest tightening. Or has Aunt Margaret found out and come back? Her breath quickened, and she clutched the old cell phone to her chest as though it were a shield. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure anyone downstairs could hear it. It felt as though it might burst out of her ribcage, its frantic rhythm keeping time with the panic rising in her mind. Lily pressed herself further into the corner, her wide, frightened eyes darting toward the attic door. She strained to hear, her small hands trembling as they gripped the phone tighter. And then, over the creaking of floorboards and muffled movements below, she heard it. A voice calling her name. Lily. It was a man's voice, deep but gentle, familiar. Her mind raced to place it, and then it struck her. Tom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears welled in her eyes, and before she could stop them, they spilled down her cheeks. She wiped at them with trembling hands, her throat tightening as emotions overwhelmed her. They're here, she whispered to herself. They've come for me. Tom led the rescue team up the narrow, creaking staircase that wound its way toward the attic. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, each sound cutting through the oppressive silence like a warning. The air grew colder as they climbed, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. The stairwell was dimly lit by their flashlights, the beams slicing through the shadows to reveal peeling wallpaper and cobwebs clinging to the corners. Dust particles floated in the air, disturbed by their movement, glinting faintly in the light. The house seemed to exhale around them, its aged wood and brittle structure groaning as if in protest of their intrusion. Tom reached the top of the stairs first, his flashlight sweeping over the closed attic door at the end of the hall. The door was warped, its edges uneven and darkened with age. He stopped in front of it, his gloved hand hovering over the doorknob. The metal was icy cold under his fingers, hard and unyielding. He paused for a moment, steadying himself. His mind was a whirlwind of urgency and dread. Would Lily be behind this door? Would she be okay? With a firm twist, Tom pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound reverberating down the hall and into the attic. His flashlight cut through the darkness, its beams sweeping across the room. The space was small and cluttered, its low, slanted ceiling making it feel even more suffocating. Broken furniture and discarded boxes littered the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust. And then he saw her. Lily was huddled in the farthest corner of the attic, a tiny figure dwarfed by the shadows around her. She looked even smaller than he had imagined, her frail frame wrapped in a threadbare sweater that hung loosely off her shoulders. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin pale and sallow. Her eyes, wide and filled with fear, turned toward him. For a moment they locked gazes, hers trembling and uncertain, his steady and reassuring. "Lily," Tom said softly, his voice breaking the heavy stillness. He took a cautious step forward, lowering his flashlight slightly to avoid blinding her. She flinched at the movement, pressing herself harder against the wall, as though trying to melt into it. "It's okay," he said gently, kneeling down to her level. "You're Lily, right? I'm Tom. Remember? We spoke on the phone." Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, quick breaths, and her hands clutched the cell phone to her chest like a lifeline. Tom held out his hand, keeping his movement slow and deliberate. "I'm here to take you somewhere safe," he said. "You don't have to stay here anymore." For a moment, Lily didn't move. Her eyes darted between his face and his outstretched hand, as though trying to decide whether he was real or another cruel trick her mind was playing on her. Then, hesitantly, she shifted. Her small hand reached out, trembling, and slid into his. Her fingers were icy to the touch. her grip weak. But to Tom, it was the strongest, most significant act of courage he had ever witnessed. "I've got you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The rest of the team stood silently behind him, their flashlights trained on the fragile figure before them. None of them spoke, unable to break the profound moment unfolding before their eyes. Tom helped Lily to her feet, her legs wobbling under her weight. She clung to his arm for support, her movement slow and cautious, as though she feared the floor might give way beneath her. As they turned to leave the attic, Lily glanced back at the corner where she had spent countless days and nights. It was dark and empty now, but to her it held the echoes of every fear, every whispered hope she had ever felt. And then she turned away, her hand tightening around Tom's as he led her down the stairs, out of the shadows and into the light. As Lily was brought outside, the faint morning sunlight brushed against her face for the first time in months. She squinted, her eyes unused to the brightness after being confined for so long in darkness. The light felt almost foreign, a sharp contrast to the dim, oppressive shadows she had grown accustomed to in the attic. It was a pale, soft light, filtered through the trees that lined the yard, their leaves trembling gently in the cool breeze of dawn. The air carried the crisp scent of wild grass and damp earth, mingling with the faint tang of morning dew. Lily inhaled deeply, the chill filling her lungs with a sense of freshness she had nearly forgotten. It was as if she were breathing for the very first time, each breath washing away a layer of the fear and suffocation that had clung to her for so long. Her small frame shivered slightly, not just from the cold but from the overwhelming flood of sensations, the sound of distant birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the hum of vehicles in the distance. It was a symphony of life, a stark reminder that the world outside her prison had continued to turn without her. A member of the rescue team approached her, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently draped a warm blanket over her thin shoulders, the weight and softness of it unfamiliar but comforting. Lily glanced up at him briefly, her wide eyes still guarded but flickering with a tentative trust. Tom knelt beside her, his face level with hers. His usually steady demeanor was softened by the overwhelming relief and compassion he felt. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and admiration, as if trying to understand how someone so small could endure so much. "You're gonna be okay, Lily," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Lily didn't respond. She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But in that moment, her eyes told him more than words ever could. In them, Tom saw something extraordinary. A tiny, resilient spark of light, fragile yet unyielding. It was the same light that had kept her alive through the darkest of nights, the same light that had guided her to pick up that old phone and call for help. Margaret returned to the house several hours later, unaware that the world she had tried to keep hidden had unraveled in her absence. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the dilapidated facade of the old house. The sight of police cars parked outside stopped her in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening as unease swept over her like a cold wave. The air seemed heavier, the usual stillness around the house now replaced by an ominous tension. Margaret's mind raced. What had happened? How had they found her? She didn't have long to wonder. Two officers approached her, their expressions calm but firm. "Margaret, we need to talk," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her body stiffened, but she didn't resist as they escorted her into one of the vehicles. Her silence wasn't born of guilt, but of resignation. She had known deep down that this day would come. In the stark, fluorescent-lit room of the interrogation center, Margaret sat at a steel table, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. Her face was a mask of neutrality, betraying none of the turmoil that had brought her to this point. "Do you understand why you're here?" the officer asked, his voice steady but edged with controlled anger. Margaret nodded faintly. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, her expression impassive. "We found Lily," the officer continued, She's safe now, but we need to know why you did it. Why would you lock a child away like that?" For a long moment, Margaret didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, almost mechanical, as though she were reciting facts rather than emotions. "I didn't hate her," she said, her tone flat. "I never hated her." The officer frowned. "Then why? Why would you do something like that?" Margaret's hands tightened slightly in her lap, her knuckles whitening. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, her words slow and deliberate. "She reminded me of everything I lost," she said. "Every time I looked at her, I saw him. I saw them, my sister, her father, their perfect little family." Her voice didn't crack, her expression didn't waver, but there was a hollowness in her words, a chasm of bitterness that spoke of years of pain. "She had his eyes," Margaret continued, her tone growing colder. "The same eyes that looked past me, that chose her over me. Every time I looked at her, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. I couldn't look at her without feeling everything I had lost." Tom, who had been listening silently from the corner of the room, felt a surge of anger rise within him. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "So you decided to punish her for your pain?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "A little girl who did nothing to you except exist." Margaret finally lifted her gaze, meeting Tom's fiery eyes with her own flat, emotionless stare. "I didn't hurt her," she said simply. "I kept her alive." Tom's jaw tightened, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to yell, to shake her, to make her understand the weight of what she had done. But more than that, he felt a deep, aching sadness. How could someone let their own pain consume them to the point of destroying an innocent child's life? How could someone justify such cruelty under the guise of their own suffering? "You didn't keep her alive," Tom said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "She kept herself alive, despite you, not because of you." Margaret's gaze faltered for the first time. She looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. But the fleeting moment of vulnerability was quickly replaced by her stoic facade. In the silence that followed, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of resolve. He had seen the spark in Lily's eyes, the unbroken spirit that Margaret's bitterness hadn't managed to extinguish, and he knew that no matter how much damage Margaret had done, Lily's light was still burning. "She'll be okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to Margaret. "She's stronger than you'll ever be." And with that, Tom turned and walked out of the room, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of her choices. Lily was taken to the hospital, where her journey toward recovery began. The days that followed were fraught with challenges. The sterile white walls of the hospital, the scent of antiseptic in the air, and the constant beeping of medical machines all felt alien to her. Lily wasn't used to the kind words of doctors and nurses, to the gentle touches as they checked her vitals or brought her warm meals. She flinched every time a door creaked open or heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, her heart racing with the irrational fear that Aunt Margaret might appear and drag her back to the attic. Her small body remained tense, her wide eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden dangers. The softness of the hospital bed, the warmth of the blankets, it all felt too foreign, too good to be true. The first few nights were the hardest. Lily lay awake in the dimly lit room, the unfamiliarity of her surroundings overwhelming her. The bed was soft, but it didn't feel safe. The quiet hum of the hospital was unlike the oppressive silence of the attic, yet it still made her uneasy. When sleep finally came, it was fitful, interrupted by dreams of shadows and creaking floorboards. One night, as she lay curled under the blankets, her body stiff with anxiety, a nurse entered the room. She moved slowly, her footsteps light as she placed a stuffed bear on the bedside table. "This is for you, Lily," the nurse said softly. "His name is Mr. Snuggles. He's here to keep you company." Lily stared at the bear for a long time before reaching out to touch it. The soft fabric felt strange against her fingertips, but she didn't pull away. She held it close to her chest, its warmth easing the knot of fear in her stomach just a little. The medical team was patient, never rushing her. They spoke to her in gentle tones, explaining every step of her treatment. Slowly, Lily began to eat more, the color returning to her pale cheeks. Her once hollow eyes started to sparkle faintly, a sign of the resilience that had carried her through the darkest days. The first time Lily slept soundly in the hospital bed, she awoke to find her pillow damp with tears. She hadn't even realized she had cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the warmth and softness of a real bed, a far cry from the cold, hard floorboards of the attic. When Lily was well enough to leave the hospital, she was placed with a foster family, a couple who had always dreamed of providing a safe haven for children in need. Their home was bright and filled with light, a stark contrast to the dim, suffocating confines of the attic. Lily, however, was overwhelmed by the sudden change. The brightness of the house felt too sharp, the laughter of the couple too loud. Every noise startled her. Every unfamiliar shadow made her flinch. She avoided their touches, shrinking away when they tried to hug her. Even the softest caress on her shoulder made her tense, her body bracing for some punishment that never came. Her foster mother, a gentle woman with kind eyes, never forced Lily to do anything she wasn't ready for. She would sit beside Lily in silence, a reassuring presence without demands. At night, she would leave the door to Lily's room ajar, the soft glow of the hallway light spilling in to chase away the darkness. One day, Lily found herself sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk. Her foster mother sat across from her, smiling but not speaking. The warmth of the mug seeped into Lily's hands, a small but comforting sensation. "Would you like to help me bake cookies today?" her foster mother asked gently. Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the floor, but then slowly she nodded. It was the first step of many, each one small but significant. Over time, Lily began to open up. She smiled for the first time in months when her foster father made a silly face during dinner. She laughed softly when the family dog licked her hand. She even allowed her foster mother to hug her briefly one evening, her tiny arms wrapping hesitantly around the woman's waist. News of Lily's rescue spread quickly, eventually reaching the ears of her father. Wow! The weight of his guilt was immediate and crushing. He had abandoned his daughter in his grief, leaving her to suffer in ways he could never have imagined. One evening, he stood on the porch of Lily's new home, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorbell. When the door opened and he saw Lily standing in the hallway, his heart broke anew. She looked so small, so fragile, yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of strength that he didn't recognize, but deeply admired. "Lily," he said, his voice cracking. Tears welled up in his eyes as he knelt to her level. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for leaving you." For a moment, Lily just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and threw her arms around his neck. She clung to him tightly, her face buried in his shoulder. "Don't leave again," she whispered, her voice muffled but firm. "I won't," her father promised, his tears falling freely now. "I'll never leave you again." 1 year later, Lily stood in the garden of her new home, the soft grass cool beneath her bare feet. The sky above her was a brilliant blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds that drifted lazily in the breeze. Birds chirped from the treetops, their songs weaving through the air like a melody of hope. Lily tilted her head back, letting the sunlight warm her face. Her foster mother watched from the porch, a gentle smile on her lips. "I'll never forget what happened," Lily said softly, her voice steady but reflective. "But I won't let the darkness control me anymore." Her foster mother approached, placing a comforting hand on Lily's shoulder. "You're stronger than the darkness, Lily," she said, "and you always will be." Lily smiled, a radiant expression that seemed to rival the sunlight itself. From the cold, shadowy attic to the bright, open garden, Lily's journey was a testament to hope, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. Her story wasn't just one of survival. It was a reminder that even in the bleakest moments, light can find its way through the cracks, illuminating the path forward. From the cold, desolate attic where darkness and fear reigned, Lily stepped into the light. With the help of kind-hearted people and the warmth of love, she found a true home, a place where she could begin a new chapter of her life. It was a home filled not with shadows but with light, laughter, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Lily's story is more than just a tale of escaping darkness. It is a testament to the power of hope and the enduring strength of compassion. Her journey reminds us that sometimes, even the faintest glimmer of light is enough to guide us through the darkest of nights. In the midst of despair, a single act of kindness, a single moment of courage can ignite a chain reaction that changes everything. Lily's resilience and the love she received prove that no matter how deep the shadows, there is always a path to the light if we choose to take it. If this story has touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to spread its heartfelt message to as many people as possible. Together, we can remind the world of the profound impact of love, kindness, and hope. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.